Welcome to Opening Voices. I'm Quentin Adams, the CEO of Clever Cloud, and today I am inviting André Loesekrug-Pietri. André is the leader of JEDI, Joint European Disruptive Initiative. The goal is to create a European DARPA. That's a good idea. Here we are, so still with André Loesekrug-Pietri from JEDI.
The force is still strong with us.
And still discussing about the tech in Europe. So we are recording in English, so if you listen us in another language, that means that it's a deep fake, but we assume it.
It's a positive fake.
It's one of the points of the story is Europe need to build a reflection together, an history together, and a common debate together. And one of the points is the difference of language. So that's one of the points of this podcast, and saying that we will translate it automatically is try to create a momentum, which will be a European momentum of the discussion. What do you think about the junction of research in Europe? And though there is some good researcher, what is the current state of where we are in Europe about the research?
Look, if we do what we do, is that we believe that we have an incredible substrate of fantastic scientists and all passionate, and we have an incredible network of universities. There has been a lot of work to create also networks of European consortia and universities. So all this, the base is there to be an incredible place to create economic value, societal value, and to ensure that actually democracies can demonstrate that they're still very relevant and very modern in the current 21st century. So the substrate is there. Then let's not be delusional, because you often hear the sentence, we have great research, but we have a difficulty to transform that into technological leaders. Clearly, we have not been able to create technological leaders in the last decades, but even on the research, we have to be careful. When you look at the top 1% cited papers, which is really not just the number of scientific papers, but the ones which are the most cited, those who are the reference in their field, all the big European countries are actually declining in the ranking. So even on research, we have to be careful that we ensure that the best researchers still do that in Europe. And then last but not least, I think we need to make this connection. It's not about mercantilization. It's not about making out of every research a product. I believe that not everything is about startups. Everything should be about excellence. But we should ensure that the purpose that we're giving, every scientist wants to have an impact. That is something that you see with every scientist. They don't want necessarily to do a product with what they do, but they want to have the feeling that they had a contribution to the society. So you have curiosity research, but you have increasingly what we call purpose-driven research. Is can we solve some of the big challenges that are facing us? And this is always starting with putting assumption, a question, what if, and then testing it and experimenting. This is the scientific method. By the way, a side word on that, AI is going to revolutionize science. That is our belief at JEDI, is that AI will allow us, probably scientists, to ask questions which are even more iconoclast and new and broaden our horizon. And it's going to allow us to experiment much faster. Think about clinical trials. Think about mathematical assumptions and validation. Think about biology. We just talked about that. I think AI is going to fundamentally accelerate science, and that's why it's so motivating.
Do you think that there is people in Europe we need to talk to? Because this podcast is about finding the good researcher, the good entrepreneur, the good technician that will make European technology. And do you think there is people we need to talk to?
I would have two messages. One is we are looking for these program managers that we talked in the previous episode, people that are passionate about the topic and that want to have an impact not just on one project but on several projects.
So if they can apply on JEDI website?
They go to JEDI.foundation, and we are really looking for these people because an organization like ours is exactly that's our base. Our fundament is these program managers. We look for people in AI, we look for people in synthetic biology, we look for people in materials, we look for people in fusion. Any topic, if you're good, please apply. And the second thing is a clear message to policymakers, because I mean, what we are doing is actually usually done by the state. Because again, there is no business case in muchos, not at the beginning. And we should avoid in Europe being the continent of reports, of assessments, of calls for action, but without the execution capability. Today, we are in a world where execution matters, where action matters, where boldness matters, where you are sure that you lose if you don't take action. You're not sure to win, but if you don't take action, you're sure you will be on the losing camp. And I think Europe is too often, I mean, think about the Draghi report. The Draghi report on industrial competitiveness was ready in May, June 2024, was only published in September 2024.
So we lose
3 months
more than
later.
a quarter?
It's talking about an existential moment for Europe. We are early November, we are November 2024. Nothing has happened. This is unacceptable. I think policymakers who are not taking actions with that sense of urgency are unfortunately making the life of current generations, but also of future generation of European much, much harder. So I think we need to and so that's my second call. So get action and take some risks. The call that we have for policymakers is saying, you put 95 billion in Horizon programs for European research, put 1% of this amount, 1%, in initiatives like JEDI or others that are going to have a radically different approach. At best, we will win because we will make some disruptions and everybody will be happy. And even if we don't win immediately because we are addressing the hardest problem, it's going to put pressure and make the 90, I talked about 95 billion, 94.1 remaining billion that you put in traditional program more efficient, because there will be a little bit of competition. There will be a little bit of emulation. The worst is when you have guaranteed budgets and with zero or very little impact assessment. So that's my second message. Policymakers, be bold, especially if you want to have a good use of your financial budgets and resources. And the third thing is to civil society, philanthropy. What is European philanthropy doing? When you have Eric Schmidt putting billions, Bezos putting billions, John and Ann Durr funding with 1 billion the Stanford Durr School of Sustainability. Where are the European philanthropists? You have a couple of them in the UK and Sweden, that are a bit in France, but very little. But I think civil society cannot expect everything from the state. It needs to step up because it's an existential challenge. We're working with them. We're very happy to make more. So civil society, don't just wait for the state to do everything. Policymakers, be bold and have a little bit of courage to use your budget in a much more efficient way. And for the greatest scientists, JEDI is your home.
That's a very interesting point. Now we have discussed a lot about with you and discuss more and discovering what JEDI does. I have another question. Say, who are you, André? Not that the people understand what you are doing and what you are fighting for. How do you become what you are? So, where do you come from, and what have you done before in your life?
Look, it's always difficult to talk about yourself, but as I mentioned, I'm a European, not only by heart, but almost by DNA. My father is from Berlin, so from northern Germany. My mom is from the south of Corsica, so the most southern tip of metropolitan France, Mediterranean. So I'm a pure product of a friendship treaty between France and Germany, you know, the arch enemies for the last centuries in Europe. And I think this is a symbol that sometimes you can overcome that, and that's why I'm still a strong believer in mankind. So that's my base. So I'm a European, north, south. So sometimes I talk with my hands. Sometimes I'm more the cliche northern Europeans. Secondly, I have a training that is both scientific. I started my career with Airbus. I attended classes at Super Aero Engineering School, so aerospace engineering. I also did business and economic studies. I studied a bit in France. I grew up in Africa because my two parents were foreign, were from two nationalities, so they were expats. So I also have been very quickly exposed to international environments. I had the opportunity to start with industry, with Airbus, but then some industrialists asked me to run their industrial family offices. So that brought me into I would say, the technology industrial investment space. One of these families asked me to do the same in Asia, which I did not know, but that was my discovery 20 years ago. And I spent almost 10 years in Asia, and particularly in Vietnam, and then based in Beijing. And probably what I do now is a direct consequence of that, because I think we still, in Europe, underestimate how much non-democratic countries are using science and technology to leapfrog and to sometimes impose their values or try to find an alternative world order. The question is not to impose, but I think we need to be proud of our democratic system. I still believe in it, but I think democratic systems should not be. They don't need to be slow. They don't need to be. They can be much more agile, and I think we need to reinvent democracy. That is the conviction I forged when I was in China. I was basically accompanying European companies in using the scale of China and of Asia. In 2017, I had really a career change, because when the French president was elected, the defense minister asked me to join its cabinet. So I was in charge of several things, including the European defense strategy and technological sovereignty. That was a word which was completely new in 2017. And this is how I got in touch with DARPA, and very quickly made the proposal to our policymakers at the European level. At that time, it was European Commissioner Moedas, as well as with many others. We made a proposal to the president to create a European version of DARPA. Interestingly, in the Sorbonne speech, which was the fundamental Europe speech of the president in 2017, there was this call for, I want to set up a European DARPA. 8 years later, we are still seeing calls, but not real action. And therefore, since I'm more in strategy, but also an action-oriented person, 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we set up JEDI, saying, okay, we cannot just wait. Let's do an entity that will be kind of a life experiment, a precursor to this agency. And this has grown. I mean, we are now 6,000 people, 43 hubs all over Europe, and several active programs. So it's working, but now we need everybody to kind of come together and ensure that Europe remains relevant. I mean, that is you asked about my personal passion. I mean, my personal mission is, how do we ensure the European values, way of life, approach remains relevant in the 21st century? So it's a huge ambition, obviously.
It's a very interesting ambition, and it's a very interesting Parker, because you know that it's interesting to see how the career of people can sculpt them and creating the way they work today. So that's a very interesting point. Just because there is something I always want to fight is, you know, when the people are looking at something, they say American technology, which is very, you know, post-Marshall Plan expression, saying that we don't know how to do it in Europe, but you know, the Americans know. Do you know few example you have of technology which are European but sold by the American?
Well, you have many examples. I mean, and the most notorious example is the IP protocol. I mean, this was basically developed at the Center for Nuclear Research, CERN, but it was then scaled, popularized by Al Gore. You remember the so-called founder of the internet. We remember his sentence, and then turned into reality and products by tech giants that emerged end of the 90s and early 2000, Google being obviously one of them, because the search engine was basically an eye into the internet that was created. That's, I think, the most notorious example. Many examples emerged from in the space industry, where most of the technologies. And what people don't know is that the first technical director of SpaceX was actually a German. I mentioned about the autonomous cars. Obviously, car industry has been shaped by the Europeans. The photovoltaic industry has been created in France and in Germany, but scaled in a massive way in China. And the big risk we are facing is that we were at the beginning of many of these disruptive technologies, or technologies in general, but today this capacity of scaling it gives you the means to actually invent the products of tomorrow, because it generates obviously the profit that allows you to reinvest. Think about the chip industry. I mean, today still one of the most valued company in the world is called ASML. It's producing the ultraviolet lithography machines that allow the chip makers to basically do chips which are smaller and smaller in terms of nanometers. Without this company, a company like TSMC or in Taiwan or others would not be able to exist. But we have to look at the future. But increasingly, I would say, global competitors understand that these machines, these technologies are key to create the industries of the future. So we need to remain at the forefront. We were at the forefront for many things in space. Last example, in biology, we talked about RNA and COVID. Let's not forget that those who invented the genetic scissor, which we call CRISPR-Cas9, was two fantastic female scientists, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Doudna in the US. And Emmanuelle Charpentier is French, working at the Max Planck in Germany. But 99% of the startups and companies applying CRISPR are in Shenzhen or in Boston. Why?
So maybe what we need is an ability to understand the technical leap. So for me, something important is we need to talk to the policymaker, but we also need to talk to the citizens and people working on the tech area. And I often say that there is two kinds of business. There is a business who can earn some assets, and there is some business who can do some flow, just a flow. And the point is, many good technical people in Europe are not working on assets. And I think there is something important there, that we need to convince the people that they can work on assets and they can work on something very technical, leading by themselves. So good technical people, you can be program manager at JEDI, but you can also be entrepreneur and creating very interesting stuff. So you can be searcher, you can be entrepreneur. So if you want to change the stuff, you need to create assets. Assets are creating by creating research, technology, then product. And I think that if we talk to the good European people of that maybe we can do something great there. So that's one of the points maybe we can do. If you agree, we will check on JEDI a little bit later. And I want to thank you a lot to accept my invitation for this very pilot episode of this new podcast. What I ask for the people, if does this have been interesting? Do you have learned something? Was the idea of AI great? And I very open to question. If you think there is someone I need to interview, there will be a form. So you just send me some contacts, and I will be reaching to you, and we will try to get to the people we need to interview and do something like that. So thank you very much for listening through us, and have a very good day. Thank you, André.
Thank you, Quentin. Great podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening Opening Voices. This was our final part interview with André Loesekrug-Pietri from JEDI. I hope you enjoy it. We will continue new interview, new leaders, new innovators inside Opening Voices. So please subscribe to our channel or our podcast, and see you later.